In the U.S., we'll deal with the rest of the world later. In the U.S., as we go into Paris, by 2020, by 2030. Okay, how many believe we're going to have it going into Paris? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. 15, that's pretty good. How many think we won't get Paris, but we'll get by 2020? And we have likewise a little less, about the same, a little less. Okay, and let's just say 2030 is we're not going to get there. How many believe U.S. is not going to get a price on carbon? We're just not going to get, nobody. Okay, so we all believe we're going to get a price on carbon. That's very useful to me to have that scientific survey. It's my pleasure. And by the way, so this is my final act as your afternoon host, and so au revoir, goodbye. It's my pleasure to introduce a person you already know. Sally, it's all yours.
Okay, this panel is the carbon budget and stranded assets and corporate responsibility. And we have heard so much this morning about financing, new technologies, low carbon technologies, carbon negative, just what, and the carbon markets that Graciela was speaking about. And where are the new markets and how does that work in reducing CO2? Well, the question is that's right before us is that there is, by the IPCC, there is a carbon budget that is the amount of carbon that we can still emit into the atmosphere and maintain a 1.5, 2 degrees Celsius or 3.56 Fahrenheit global rise in temperature. And that has been estimated, depending on who you talk to, and these experts will probably have maybe some different numbers, but from 500 gigatons to 866 gigatons. Now, if you had a budget and someone said, where are you going to invest that budget to take care of yourself over the next X years? Where would you expend that carbon? Would you expend it on carbon negative technologies? Would you expend it on food, energy, water, security, the nexus of climate change, mitigation? How would you do that? Or would you make, more widgets and more stuff? Well, it's going to be a little bit of both. But hopefully, and then the next piece is the responsibility, the social and environmental responsibility of corporations. So from that, I want to introduce our panel really quickly. Rick Heedy is an old friend of mine. He started the Climate Mitigation Services and also the Climate Accountability Institute, which I'm happy to serve on the board. And he's done some really remarkable research called Carbon Majors, which is looking at the corporations in the world that are responsible for the majority of the CO2 and from an extraction point of view. Randy Hayes, whom you've heard from before, and he was our host this morning, is that he has something now called Foundation Earth, and he's really looking at corporate responsibility, and he's going to tell us a little bit about that. Kira Wenke is from Germany, and she is an analyst. She has a deep background in looking at how do you move economies into decarbonization, into carbon markets, and she and the director of her institute, which you can read about in the bios, are directly advising President Merkel in Germany to move that country into a low carbon economy. So I think I'll start with Rick, and then we'll go from there.
Thanks, Sally. Can we bring up the presentation? Thanks. The fossil fuel industry hasn't been mentioned much today, but I want to focus on its responsibility in terms of producing most of the fossil fuels that the world has ever used. In particular, a subset of those industries and entities called the carbon majors. There are about 90 large fossil fuel producing companies in the world. And what really concerns me is that we've spent decades now since Amory came on the scene arguing that saving energy costs less than producing energy. And we're still increasing our production of fossil fuels. We can see the response in the atmosphere on the left-hand side. Our emissions are rising steeply still. We can see that in the center. The Global Carbon Project will come out with a report in September that suggests that our emissions will increase by another 2% or so this past year. And of course, we know the temperature response is also increasing. And the IEA came out with a statement a couple of years ago saying that we're on a path to long-term average temperature increase of 3.6 degrees centigrade. And Kira might even suggest that that's conservative. And there's no resource limit on our future production of fossil fuels. Ultimately, there will be, but there are plenty of resources in the ground. Oil and gas reserves are increasing. Industry spends hundreds of billions of dollars a year making sure that they can replace current production with new reserves. This year, I think they'll spend close to $800 billion on exploration and production. So oil and gas resources are increasing. A lot of that is in OPEC nations. Coal resources are vast, and we hopefully will leave some of that in the ground. As Amory said years ago, the most productive use of coal is to keep the ground up. And that may be a foresightful thing to say. So oil and gas, particularly oil in the right-hand chart, has been increasing dramatically over the past couple of 3 decades, even though we've used hundreds of billions of barrels. We've used 1.25 trillion barrels of oil since the beginning of oil production 130 years ago or so now. And still the reserves exceed 1.6 trillion barrels of oil. And we probably have another 1.3 or 4 trillion barrels of oil to find and produce. If you combine all the proven reserves of oil, gas, and coal, we come out with a number of potential emissions of carbon dioxide that exceeds what the IEA and other entities have concluded we cannot burn. We can only consume about 1/3 of it if we want to protect the 2 centigrade degree goal that most nations of the world have agreed to, most Annex 1 nations. And I've estimated that the total potential emissions of existing proven reserves, let alone what we have yet to find, is 2,700 billion tons of CO2, which accounts for non-fuel uses of oil, natural gas, and to some extent coal in its emissions estimate. Historically, for the past 130 years of oil and gas and 250 years of coal use, we've emitted 1,290 billion tons of carbon dioxide. So the reserves exceed that by 2.1 times. The IPCC and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change agree that the Annex 1 nations bear the brunt of the responsibility for historic emissions and the wealth created through those emissions, and thus the burden of dealing with the problem of climate change. And the Annex 1 nations have picked up that theme, but I am concerned that considering that we've worked on 19 COPs now, COP 20 is coming up in Lima, in Peru in December, and COP 21 in 2015 in Paris. We have yet to peak our emissions. They're rising rapidly by 2 or 3% per year, and it's a little bit too late. And I'm looking at other ways of the core problem being addressed by the entities themselves that produce the carbon that is sold on the market. If you look on a chart, if we look at historic emissions by nations, about 60% of the historic emissions can be attributed to 5 countries. Some of those countries are listed here. The US, of course, being the leader in almost 27% of historic emissions from 1750 to the present time. Russia, including the former Soviet Union, 11%, and China only about 9% or less. But if we look at where the oil industry itself is projecting emissions to go, and this may be a bit self-serving on their part, they're hoping that the international climate negotiations will not succeed so that they can have a free market to produce their oil and gas and coal. And the BP figure is on the left. In their estimate and the IEA's, the 450 part per million scenario that equates to the 2 centigrade degree guardrail that we're aiming to not exceed is the dotted red line, and the top green line is where they expect fossil fuel consumption to actually go. You can see that on the right-hand figure as well. The black figure is historic emissions, and we're now exceeding the RCP 8.5 chart, the graph line, the dotted blue line, going steeply up to the right. We're exceeding the maximum RCP model that the IPCC is working on, whereas we need to stay at or below the small dotted line descending to the right. We're not meeting that objective. And so I want to shift some responsibility and accountability to the fossil fuel industry that has produced the lion's share of the emissions that consumers have made over the last 250 years. These producers have a moral responsibility, and perhaps even a legal one, to help address the climate change issue. So far, they have very little responsibility for doing that because nobody's blaming them for the problem. We're blaming ourselves as nations and consumers and emitters. I want to shift at least partial responsibility to those producers that have helped disinform the public and I think misled legislators around the world to not pass progressive and effective climate legislation. They have the capital and the skills, and I think the moral mandate to help address the problem. They earn about $5 trillion a year, and if we can create a mandate and an effective responsibility through accountability, they will increase their investments in renewables, in some of the ideas that Graziella presented and others presented this afternoon. But we need the we need the elephant in the room to help do some of the heavy lifting and not just pass the cost on to taxpayers and consumers. And I'll describe in a moment what my Carbon Majors project hasn't done. I've had a team around the world looking at annual reports of production of fossil fuels by these incorporated entities over the past 150 years. And I'll share some of those results with you in a minute.
Thank you, Rick. This also, because he addressed reserves, brings up the point of stranded assets. And just briefly, stranded assets are described as those reserves that are on the balance sheets of the fossil fuel industry that have not yet been developed, and they play into the market share and the share price of many of these companies. Again, depending on who you talk to, 100% of those should stay in the ground, those reserves. Others say 80%. We heard the figure this morning that, again, depending on who you talk to about what our carbon budget is over what period of time, if you spread out that budget, 2044 is the absolute max that we can go if we're very judicious about how we use that. And then you would have to stop that day if you didn't want to go into the 4-degree centigrade rise in global temperature, which, by the way, is 7.36 Fahrenheit. So, talking about corporations and responsibility, Randy, would you take this conversation that next step, because that's what you've been working on?
Sure. Oh, I don't need that clicker, those things scare me. Well, if we're going to have this great transition that Lester Brown and some of the other speakers, spoke about earlier today. It's, of course, fundamentally important that we really know the nature of the problem we're trying to fix, right? So I thought, in terms of getting around to corporate and government responsibility, I'd start by just asking us all to consider that climate change is not really the problem that we think it is, right? And in the simple sense, okay, what is climate change? In the simple sense, it's the average temperature rise from greenhouse gas emissions, just to put it simply, right? But some people would argue that it's really a symptom of a deeper problem, right? And there are different versions people would give on what's that deeper problem, you know? I would imagine that Chief Looking Horse would think, well, climate change is a problem, yeah, but it's a symptom of a deeper problem. Perhaps, he would think that it's, the lack of a spiritual connection to the earth as a whole, a spiritual connection to Mother Nature, or a sense of that the other aspects of the web of life are, in fact, all our relations, in the sense that there are cousins and uncles and brothers and things like that, and I would agree with that. I think we all would on some level. But I want to posit that if it's really a symptom of a deeper problem, another way to think about this is that it's really the unanticipated consequences of earlier technology choices. And to underscore that particular point, I want to read a quote from Jared Diamond. Many of you know the work of Jared Diamond and the book's Collapse and all of that. And what Jared said, he says, of all of our current environmental problems are unanticipated harmful consequences of our existing technology. And the second part of his quote says, there is no basis for believing that technology will miraculously stop causing new and unanticipated problems while it is solving the problems that it previously produced. So I throw that on the table just to say, let's be careful around some of the techno-optimism that infiltrates our circles here. And let's continue to challenge ourselves about sort of the deeper nature of the problem. Because if you think back into the 17 or 1800s when people started switching from wood to coal and then to oil, those choices seemed like a pretty good idea at that time, right? They really didn't anticipate that there would be such a terrible price to pay as the kind of cataclysmic consequences that Graciela and Rick and others have alluded to in this situation. So we really have to get to the deeper nature of this problem. And it really could be that, that part of this package of the solution, because many things need to happen, is that we ought to be thinking about the long view of the situation. We ought to be thinking about coming up with a technology policy. I'm not aware of a single nation state anywhere on the planet Earth that has a national technology policy, right? But if new technologies, and Jim, you asked us earlier today to consider a new technology with, somewhere between a hot and cold fusion. Well, does that mean that he should not pursue that direction? No, I don't believe it means it shouldn't pursue it, but it does mean that we ought to be careful about unanticipated harmful consequences and identify them early on if, in fact, they are out there. So somebody out in the audience, I would like you to start drafting the National Unanticipated Consequences Act of 2015. And we need to register these new technologies so we can track them. We need to report on possible unanticipated consequences, and we need to think about maybe 5-year national assessment reports. That's the kind of part of the government responsibility, that I'd like to see from some of these situations. And then I just wanted to make another brief point about being ecological truth tellers in this situation around these carbon budgets and the plans to get there. Because our president, who I like many aspects of our president here in the United States, but he has this all-of-the-above strategy, for dealing with climate. And a good friend of mine, S. David Freeman, was saying just recently that he sees that all above strategy as a one-way ticket to climate hell. You know, if you believe the numbers that were just thrown out on the table, you know, all of the above strategy doesn't cut it. But it's not only the American president who's not telling the ecological truth about what needs to be done. Most of the major environmental groups are not either, right? So we've got to get out there and become these ecological truth tellers. And David Freeman said that if he pondered, you know, a plan commensurate with the scale of the problem that scientists say that we need to get to, we need to have a moratorium on any new of the 4 poisonous energy systems, right? Coal, oil, methane gas, and nuclear. I mean, Fukushima is enough to let us know that that's not the direction we want to go in, right? Even though it's not the big greenhouse gas emitter. And then he said, more than just a moratorium, we need a national mandate for that kind of a moratorium and a national mandate to decommission the existing 4 toxic energy systems at about 3% per year if we want to get to the numbers and stay within the budget that we've been talking about, right? And most of the plans are dealing with power plants. That doesn't deal with at all with the fact that most homes are heated with natural gas. And when people think that natural gas is a transition fuel, and my understanding is that it's 85 times more damaging than carbon dioxide in the first 20 years of being emitted. That's no transition pool. It may be worse than coal. Natural gas, in my mind, might very well be worse than coal. So again, we have to, you know, ponder these things at these deeper levels. And then the last point around corporate responsibility is when I saw the title of this panel, I read it as corporate/government responsibility. And I thought, oh, well, that's at least honest because corporate governance is really what we have these days, isn't it? I thought it was a typo. You know? And of course, we have to put the public back into public governance. I prefer the phrase public governance to democracy because democracy has been so sullied by President Cheney, Dick Cheney, and others, in my mind. But in fact, corporate and government responsibility, I think really on that, what I'll say, Sally, is that let's say responsible to who or responsible to what? You know, let's take a look at that aspect of the question. You know, and I remember when I started Rainforest Action Network, I thought to myself, in whose eyes do I want to remain credible? You know, the membership that gives me $25 a year, you know, primarily their eyes. The high donors who give me $1,000 a year, in their eyes. My hardworking staff in the finance or program departments, you know. And I thought, well, no, I think it's to the rainforest itself that I really want to stay credible, right? And if you think about that in terms of governments, who do they need to be responsible to? Their citizenry that elect them, of course. But really, if you understand the fundamental nature of the interconnectedness of the web of life, if you understand the all my relations aspect of native wisdom, then we know that every single government needs to be responsible to the whole, to the entirety of the biosphere. Because when you understand that deep level of government responsibility, and why would a corporation not have to have a similar responsibility? The 90 giant companies that Rick mentioned need to have that same level of responsibility to the whole. Because when you understand that, you understand that there is really no corporate profit on a dead planet. You know, there's no social justice on a dead planet. There's no national welfare or national security on a dead planet. And if the positive feedbacks or the reinforcing feedback loops kick into gear like some scientists fear they might, we could be headed towards Venus and not even just 4 degrees centigrade. So that's the kind of responsibility I want out of every single corporation and every single government on planet Earth.
All of the above strategy really comes out of the out of the stranded asset piece. It's $7 trillion is estimated to be tied up in these stranded assets. And fossil fuel companies are still out there looking for where they can plant their flags in the Arctic Ocean so that when there's no ice, they can continue to develop reserves. And because of the contributions that happen, both on Republican and Democrat side for fossil fuels, there's a step back of really being able to take the kind of bold, courageous action that has to happen with governments as related to the corporations who are running the show. So I know that Germany has had some really, you've been at this for a long time, moving into an economy that is going away from, in fact, you've shut down your nuclear plants after Fukushima. And also you've been moving out of fossil fuels for some time. And tell us a little bit about that process, because that is a template in some regards. There's an economy of scale that's at play here, but there is a template there that the United States and other countries could look at.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I want to give like a little preface to why we're doing it. So let's take a look at global temperatures over the last 100,000 years, very briefly. So we had a lot of changes in global mean temperature. But if you look at that very last part, that's the last 11,000 years. And that's in fact the time that our civilization developed. This is the time of the Neolithic Revolution, when we became settled. This is the first time when human population overcame the point of 1 million people. So this is a time of a very stable climate as well, if you look at that. So, but what is happening since 1750, as you said? So this is a map that shows how the carbon emissions cumulative are increasing over the planet. So it started in Great Britain, but soon you see the next player, Germany, France, it's 1811, US. Then we speed this up a little bit because of the time constraints, and you see the globe is carbonizing. For the first 100 years, nothing much happened, but now it's. Then there's India. Then we're now seeing the whole entire planet becoming blue, but still Africa is largely not carbonized. Latin America. Now we're heading towards the First World War. Now we're heading towards the Second World War. You see that the powers that are opposing each other, it's very interesting that you can actually see how history plays itself out in this sort of, we call it sea story, the story of carbon in the world. You see Japan, it goes up, the whole globe basically turns red. It goes to 2009 from our scientists. And so this is what, we're probably now a little more red right now, and this is what we're at right now. So what does this cause? This is the Holocene moved in, so the last 11,000 years. And you see this very red spike at the very end within the last, let's say, like 50 to 100 years, just spikes up. Doesn't look very natural to me, but maybe somebody has a different opinion on that. So what does it mean? This is from the IPCC, the new one. This is the 2-degree guardrail, and above the 2-degree guardrail line, we see that the risks are increasing. And well, why should we care about this? These are risks for unique and threatened systems, such as the coral reefs. These are risks to human populations living on coastal areas and all these, or for extreme weather events. So why should we care about this? Well, let's talk about the laws of civilization. The first law of capitalism, don't kill your customers. So that would be maybe one reason. The first law of socialism, don't kill your comrades. And overriding all these laws, the first law of humanity, don't kill your children. So I guess that's something we can all agree upon, and this is why we should take action. And Germany has after the Fukushima disaster, started to take action on its own energy system. This is really important because we need early action. As you talked about peaking earlier, we need to have an early emissions peak because we're still increasing, and then decrease very steeply, because the later we peak on and the later we make the turnaround, the more expensive it's going to get, the more unlikely it's going to get, because then you have to go very high into negative emissions. It's very, very difficult at a certain point. It just becomes more and more unrealistic that we stay below the 2-degree line. So we developed, since we're on the budget panel, I wanted to talk to you about what we did at the WBGU. We did a report in 2009, and so there's a scientist from the Potsdam Institute who calculated that to keep the 2-degree line with a 75 probability, you can probably emit like 1,000 billion tons, it's like 1,000 gigatons of CO2 between 2000 and 2050. So, and this number you can change if you change the probability of how to keep the 2-degree target. So 75% is pretty good. And so 2050, now we're 2014, we've used up, I think almost half. So we're approaching the half very, very closely. So what does this mean? We calculated now from this scientific research, we calculated in relative to population of the countries, what is the budget for the countries? So we looked at historic emissions from 1990 till 2009, and shockingly, even to us, was the budget of Germany is used up, the US budget has been used up, and for a lot of other countries in the industrialized world, this is true. So if you look at the future and you look at carbon emissions from there also, the budget is close to be used up. So this is like an emission trajectory of how it should look like if you want to, I know it's a little blurred, but this very steep line, the black line is the US. And the line where it ends down there is 2020. So this is how it should look like if they want to keep within a budget in the sense of that every person on Earth has the same carbon space. Because we're using up as much as if there were 2-3 worlds, but there's only one world. So Germany is the blue line, and then below goes China and then India. So it's a little bit different because some of these countries have not used as much emissions, and they also have a higher population than we do. So now we divide into country groups. So the country group 1 is like for instance the US and Germany, and so this is still without emissions trading, but you can offset that, of course, with emissions trading. Then these trajectories look a little bit different. That means you can still emit, but you just have to sort of pay for it. You trade it off with other countries who do not emit as much and who are developing in a way that is more sustainable than we did. So we had a symposium with our chancellor, and she is a physicist, and she recognizes the threats of climate change, of course, and so she recommended to check what happens if nothing happens, because we naturally assume that if we don't do anything, just nothing's going to happen. But that's not the case. If we don't do anything and just continue as business as usual, we have these very big risks coming up. So the German energy transition, very quickly, what we concluded upon is that after the Fukushima incident, the Merkel government did a whole turnaround in its nuclear policy. So they decided that they will phase out nuclears by 2022. And within 1 week, they shut down 8 of the nuclear plants that we have. And the other ones will be down by 2022. And the next target is that to increase the renewables and power production to 80% to 2050. This means by 2030, about half. And where we're at today, so these 8 facilities were shut. In that same year, we still exported energy. So we still had more energy than we needed. And 25 of electricity consumption percent comes right now from renewables as of January 2014. I think it's risen even up until now. Yeah, it's a lot actually, yeah. Yeah, and I mean, look at this offshore wind farm. I think it's like the coolest thing, really. It's amazing what these new technologies are opening us up to. So, but of course there are some problems. So what we did is we enacted this law because we can change our laws, but we cannot change the laws of physics. So we did the German Energy Renewable Act, and this is an old law, but it has been reformed several times, and a problem of this law has been that so it's like a surcharge to what you consume. So the more you consume, the more you have to pay. So so now the bizarre situation is the way it was designed was that the surcharge at some point last year surpassed the price of electricity, because the wholesale price of electricity for the renewables especially also, they went down, down, down. But it crossed at some point. So people were very, very upset about this, and I mean, it's rightly so. But if you look at the bigger picture, people are complaining about rising energy prices, and they've risen because of the retail price, not because of the surcharge necessarily. Because you can see, like, the spot market price, it goes sort of down, and the renewable energy surcharge has gone up. But in fact, it's this very red line up there, the retail price, that is pushing the general price. And another thing is, have emissions been rising? Unfortunately so. And this is, well, but you see, so we look at 2007, and then the financial crisis hit, so the emissions went down because also productivity went down. And since then, they have been rising a little bit, which is unfortunate, because we're trying to increase, and the share of renewable increase the shares of renewables has increased, and this will in the long term push the emissions down again. But in the short term, it looks like they're rising. But if you see, like in the year that we shut down the nuclear plants in 2011, it did not rise. It stayed at the same number. So it's not necessarily, the rising of emissions is connected to a lot of things. For instance, how cold the winter is. Because if it's a long winter and very cold, then people consume a lot of oil, for instance, or gas to heat their homes. So, but this is something we'll work on, and it cannot go on because there's a law that keeps us from rising above a certain level, and so we have to cut emissions. So, yeah, I mean, so sort of the conclusion is, for me, is that we all have to wake up to the situation, because you can wake up somebody who's asleep, but you cannot wake somebody up who's pretending to be asleep. And I think that's sort of the situation that we're in right now. So let's wake up. Thank you.
Thank you, Kira. I'd like to go back to Rick and some of the conclusions that you've come to in Carbon Majors.
Yeah, let's take a look. Could you key up the presentation again? So I want to go back just for a second to John Brown, who's now Lord Brown. He was CEO of British Petroleum, now BP, from 1995 to 2007. He gave a talk at Stanford in 1997. And halfway down his slide, we can read his quote. "We have a responsibility to act," that is as an oil company. "And I hope that through our actions we can contribute to the much wider process which is desirable and necessary. BP accepts that responsibility." And I think that harkens to what Randy referred to in terms of corporate responsibility for the planet that we all share. And my work is addressed at leveraging some of that responsibility and the subsequent actions that they will presumably make in defense of their corporate credibility and their brand. So we started this work about 10 years ago with several volunteers around the world, looking at libraries and dusty stacks of annual reports of oil and gas and coal companies going back to as early as 1854. We selected the companies first on the basis of their current production of carbon fuels at about 8 million tons of carbon per year. So we ended up with 90 carbon major entities. Most of them are investor-owned companies that you know, Shell, ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips. Many of them, 31 of them, are state-owned oil and gas and coal companies. Coal India, for example, Saudi Aramco, Petroleos de Venezuela, Petrobras in Brazil, etc., including Statoil in Norway, for example. And 9 of them are nation states because we wanted to cover some of the countries that didn't have a vibrant market economy at the time to capture some of their coal production. So we have 7 cement producers included, 55 of natural gas and petroleum producers, and 36 coal producers. We went back and calculated and documented fossil fuel production for each of their entities by fuel from as early as we could find the annual reports. So we probably know more about the corporate history of fossil fuel production than many of these companies themselves have not calculated their potential emissions. So we wanted to calculate the eventual emissions of each of these fuels as used by consumers, trace them back to the original producers, but deduct for non-energy uses, particularly for oil and natural gas. And what we ended up with over time, I'll show you one example worksheet from Chevron from 1912 to 2010. It looks at all their mergers and acquisitions from 1912 forward. They inherited Gulf and Tenneco and Getty Oil and 76 and some other entities. We account for their production. We calculate their emissions by fuel, natural gas in this case, and oil, all the way to 2010. And we end up, if we aggregate all the 90 entities, we end up with 63% of all industrial sources of carbon dioxide from 1750 to 2010, traced back to the production by these 90 entities for as early as 1850 to 2010. So on average, we were looking at about 60% of annual production by these 90 entities. And that includes methane as well, because we include not only emissions from the products sold, but their corporate direct emissions from vented CO2, from raw natural gas, methane leakage from oil and gas and coal production, CO2 from their own fuel used to run refineries and pipelines and tankers and such. Overall, on average, 10% is from direct emissions and 90% is from the products they sell. So these are some of the top 20 entities in percent of total industrial CO2 emissions since 1750 attributed to each of these entities. So the top investor-owned company is Chevron in the United States at about 3.5% and going on down the line to some of the smaller companies, including the state-owned Saudi Aramco and Petroleum de Venezuela, etc. We actually received a letter from Peabody Coal asking us to cease and desist to use their corporate image in images like this, which we circulated around to newspapers around the world when the scientific paper came out in Climatic Change in January of this year. They didn't want their corporate image to be associated with this kind of work, and so they asked us to cease and desist, but we feel it's appropriate commercial use of any of these logos to have them associated with what we view as factual history of carbon emissions from their corporate production of fossil fuels over the year. I haven't heard from Chevron or any of the other companies, but Peabody saw fit to ask us to cease and desist, which we did not do. So in the top chart here, if you have all total emissions from 1750 to the present, the left hand is the corporate emissions inventories. On the bottom there, you just see the top 20 in a graphic format. But going back to Sally's point on reserves, if I interpret the IPCC reports correctly, we're looking at a maximum of 455 billion tons of carbon remaining in the carbon budget from 2010 forward. That probably has to be reduced by other sources of CO2 emissions, forestry, for example, and the biosphere. So let's look at this at the maximum. I looked at all the annual reports filed with the SEC and other entities on proven recoverable reserves on the statements and books of the 90 carbon majors, and only 9% of that is owned by investor-owned companies of oil and gas and coal to combine. 9% of the total IPCC budget is owned by these entities. So we may be talking about stranded assets, but we also need to focus on the state-owned enterprises that own 45% of the remaining carbon budget. And I think I'll stop there. We can discuss next steps later on.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to go back to what Randy was saying about natural gas and a transition fuel and all that, one of the reasons we are where we are, not just in the United States but globally, but particularly here, is we don't have an energy plan. We've just grown topsy-turvy, and what comes on the market next that looks like it's a cleaner fuel, and we did not have to engage in retooling our infrastructure, so natural gas was there, 30% less CO2. But is it the answer? No, it's not the answer. But we didn't have a plan. We don't have a plan that says that we're going to go to natural gas, and then in X year, by Y date, we're going to be transitioned to X amount of renewables. So that piece hasn't happened. The other thing is that question for anybody here is, and I have to believe that those companies and the CEOs of these companies and their employees have children and grandchildren. I'm going to assume that. So do you think that this can be done voluntarily, or we need regulation? Germany went through a long process of engaging the public, engaging companies, have been at it for some 20 years actually, to create a plan that goes through 2050. So what's your response? I would say Randy, any of you, but Randy first. And we've only got a couple minutes left.
Yeah, no, I've got a history with voluntary codes of conduct. I mean, Rainforest Action Network, and many of you out in the audience helped us win a number of campaigns. So thank you very much. But whether it was the Burger King boycott to get them to stop buying rainforest beef, or Home Depot, the world's largest retailer of wood, to stop selling old-growth wood, or Citibank to quit financing illegal logging in Southeast Asia, or any of these campaigns, we were able to, we had enough of a grassroots army to get them down on one bended knee and get them to kind of sign a deal. But those were voluntary codes of conduct. And most of our solution scenarios are still in that realm of voluntary codes of conduct. The Equator Principles, which are the large banks that have come out with some environmental screens, again, voluntary codes of conduct. And they just haven't created the great ecological U-turn. They didn't get the job done. I really firmly believe, and my shift over to Foundation Earth was in part to draft what we've just completed, and it's on our website. It's a law, a draft law on mandatory corporate disclosure of ecological impacts. So the pollution externalities across the board, and we're asking them to put them into, in a sense, biospheric logic. There are there's one scientific system says there are nine aspects of the life support systems of the biosphere, whether it's nitrogen and phosphorus runoff, or freshwater, the demise of freshwater, biological diversity, or climate change. There are 9 aspects of the life support systems of the biosphere, and I think we need mandatory corporate disclosure. That doesn't even solve the problem, but it's a key step towards the true cost economy and sending the right price signals that Graciela was talking about in her redesign of capitalism.
Kira?
I think we need a social contract. We need a contract with society, and this sort of requires a global social movement. And there are a lot of signs that this is starting to happen, and we see it in various forms. I mean, we see it here with so many people attending. We see it in Germany. There is a growing cooperatives, people who produce their own energy by jointly buying or jointly building a wind farm, a windmill. So you see different types of public participation. I think this is very key, because we cannot constantly delegate our responsibility to the political level and expect them to do something but not have that an impact on our life. So we need like this horizontal movement, and we need to take responsibility ourselves.
Rick?
I think the fossil fuel industry has obviously created a lot of wealth and comfort and improved lifestyles around the world. Most of us, I mean, mostly for those of us in Aspen and in the developed world. But with that comes a responsibility to address the problems that they have helped create. If we take all the fossil fuel production on an annual basis and reduce it to liquid fuels per second, we're looking at 14,000 cubic feet of fuel per second. You can go down the street and look at the Roaring Fork River, and it's running about 54 cubic feet per second. And I think we need to keep the fossil fuel industry, their feet to the fire. I don't think we're going to solve the problem of climate change by establishing financing for renewables. That's obviously critical. We need an alternative path to non-carbon fuels. But we need to address the fossil fuel industry head on. They're the elephant in the room, and if we ignore them and the market takes its usual muddling through as the way we are accustomed to in this world, we'll end up with exceeding the 2-degree budget by a long mile. And we need to do more than simply creating alternatives. We need to keep their feet to the fire and have them and mandate them to create some climate stewardship in their corporate activities.
And we're going to have to close here, but there's two things I want to mention, which I think, Randy, you're the one who touched on this, is the externalities. Those costs have been really divorced from pricing. So we have an artificial system based on cheap fossil fuels, and that piece needs to be accountable. Fossil fuel industry needs to be accountable for those costs, the pollution costs, et cetera. The other thing is governance. And that gets into, yes, there's voluntary, but also at the level that we have to reduce emissions, it's really governments that have to tackle that at that level and collaborate at that level. And that's why Paris is so important, and there's a lot of people that work in this arena who have no confidence that anything substantial is going to come out of the UNFCCC negotiations in Paris. And if there's just enough there to get the process started, then it does come back to the individual governments, whatever they can agree to on a global level, and then come back to their own governments and start looking at what they can do. The carbon budget, however, asks us, invites us, informs us that this has to be proportional to those who are emitting the most to those who are emitting the less. There's a very interesting, and I'm going to close here, there's a book that came out a few years ago called Heat by George Monbiot. And he said that if we were going to ration CO2 to every human on the planet, it would be 1.3 tons. That's it. Americans use about 23 tons. So if that was your ration, if you wanted to use it all in January on whatever, then what do you do the rest of the year? But this is getting to the horizontal. We've had elite energy held by a few. And and that's been a vertical system. But what's starting to happen through distributive energy and what we've been talking about here is it's moving out into a horizontal. It's going to have to equalize. So with that, I want to thank our panelists. This has been a really provocative conversation, and thank you all for sticking in here so long. Thank you.